Good morning, PF Warriors, and welcome to the last PF Warrior meeting of 2020. This year will live in infamy, and I hope all of you will have a great holiday season coming up and within your little bubble. I know you won't be having big extended family meetings, but it's still a great time to reflect on the year and, all we've lived through and what we've learned. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Shelley Mathis, Vice President of the PF Warriors. I'm sitting in as host today for Bill Vick, who's had some dental surgery and he's recovering. He's at the audience. So if I do anything wrong, hopefully he can come in and make it all well. I'm also here with my husband, Scott Calhoun, who is a PF patient, and he'll be with me during the chat room discussions. We're lucky to have a brilliant psychologist, Dr. Kim Gorgens, today to join us from Denver. I was reading an article not long ago in the New York Times about emotionally preparing for cold weather. And I thought that's a great topic for our group. And then the more Dr. Gorgens was being interviewed, and I thought, well, you know what? I'm just going to contact her and see if she'd talk to our group. And I made sure I stalked all her websites and all her Facebook posts and things like that. And then there was so much more to her background and the depth of knowledge and education and what she was doing that I knew she would be an important speaker for us to hear. So she agreed to join us to talk about resilience and compassion, among other. Dr. Gorgens wants this to be an interactive meeting, as do I, but we have so many guests that we'll need for you to send your questions into the chat room and we will ask them as they appear. But I'll start certified rehabilitation psychologist and professor of psychophysiology, clinical neuropsychology, and psychology of criminal behavior at University of Denver. She works with rheumatoid arthritis patients and support groups, and that's a condition many of our folks know very well. She manages a large portfolio of brain-related research and has lectured extensively on those subjects, including some TED Talks, which I've watched, and they're wonderful. She talks about youth sports injuries and concussions. She's been interviewed by NPR, CNN with Anderson Cooper, featured in Newsweek, USNews, New York Times, and more. So welcome, Dr. Gorgens, to the PF Warriors this morning. I see you're muted. Let me see if I can unmute you. There you are.
Good.
And
thank you.
Yes. So how's the cold weather in Denver today?
It is cold weather in Denver.
Okay.
And it's so great to see all these faces, and thanks to everybody for carving out time this morning in a really hectic, trying season to spend an hour and a half with us. Is for me, it's such a lovely opportunity, and I'm so grateful to Shelley and to Bill, and thank you to the PF Warriors for inviting me here. I'm really excited to talk about how unprecedented this is for all of us, and especially for folks with an invisible condition or a chronic illness, like in this case, pulmonary fibrosis and all of the related conditions. And more than anything, it's really a conversation about stigma. And my whole career is built on studying the biological bases of the kinds of distress that all of us experience anywhere on the continuum up through mental illness, and to really appreciate how that is in some ways cause and consequence of some of the other conditions that all of us have, and to use that biological understanding to address the stigma, the sense of personal vulnerability or weakness, or the sense of a personal failing around depression or anxiety, and to normalize that, and more than anything, to talk about the tools that are supported best in the research and how to address that.
Okay.
And Shelley made the point that and this is what I love, and you guys will have to shut me up at 90 minutes, but I typically teach for 3 hours at a time. My students have to tell me to stop talking at 3 hours. So the chance to actually have a conversation with people is the best novelty ever. And I'll try to turn off my professor head everywhere possible. Shelley made the point that, like, listen, nobody wants to be talked at. People really want to have a conversation, which is exactly what I was hoping to hear. So Shelley, I know you have some questions teed up.
I do. So given your background, from your neuroscientist point of view, how is brain function, cognition, coping ability affected by worry, anxiety, depression, and feeling isolated?
Yeah. It's all part of the same pot. It's the same organ, if you think of it like that. And there's great data to suggest that our cognition, so things like how fast we can process information or our capacity for short and long-term memory, how fragile those functions are and how vulnerable those functions are to things like depression, anxiety, distraction, worry. Loneliness is kind of an overarching concept that eats away at all cognition. It's temporary, so that's the good news, right? That you have a temporary decrease in cognitive performance, but it doesn't make it any more bearable in the moment. So the importance of addressing the kinds of conditions that impact cognitive function, it's so important. A lot of folks just assume that their cognitive function, when they feel slowed or foggy or kind of mentally sluggish, you just assume that that's the new normal. And especially as your mood starts to creep lower, you may feel lonely, you feel anxious, you have this kind of baseline state of worry, and you just assume that this is the new normal, that this cognitive slowing and this foggy feeling is, I guess this is how my brain works now. And it isn't. And there's so much to do to really tweak that and to turn it around.
Yes, my brain, I have no vocabulary now that we've been isolated so long. My memory is gone. So yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Right, exactly. And it's so plastic. That's the great thing. That's what I love about studying the brain. And this with mental illness and disease and injury, the brain is so plastic. It's remarkable. So all of the changes that you might attribute to anxiety or depression or the kinds of word finding problems that you have, all of that is mutable. That means it's changeable.
Well, what's your best tip for getting the brain back into working order?
Such a great question. I think about it from a clinical perspective. I think of 3 areas of function that impact brain function. We talk a lot about mood. I'm going to talk a lot about sleep. I cannot overstate the importance of sleep and quality sleep. And then the third is this category of pain and discomfort. And what I hope to be able to communicate is that those 3 spheres of function, we think of them as like, these are 2 or 3 separate areas. There's no overlap. I don't sleep well. So that's my problem, instead of seeing the relationship between sleep, mood, and pain. So there's tremendous overlap in all of those areas. And from a clinical perspective, if you can get traction in any one of these 3 areas of function, from a clinical perspective, I call them buckets, like the 3 buckets of function, you can fix function in the other 2 areas. So for example, if you can't get any traction with mood, for example, you might try fixing sleep, even if sleep seems okay, to get an improvement in mood. Or you might try better pain management to get an improvement in mood or an improvement in sleep. So those 3 things give you a lot of latitude from a biohacking perspective. I had the chance to talk to Bill and Shelley ahead of time, and we talked a lot about, I follow the biohacking community really closely, and I love to be able to apply the neuroscience research in real time to like, okay, well, how do we make our cognition better? How do we make our mood better? people with chronic illness are biohackers by nature. You don't have the luxury of not being biohackers, right? You know your bodies and you know how to apply the research better than anyone. So what I hope is that I'm giving you some more tools. So as we talk about ways to fix mood, ways to fix sleep, ways to improve pain or physical distress, applying those in any one of those three areas will yield improvement in the other areas. And it really is like this beautiful system of connected experience.
Well, let me throw out just kind of like a something out of left field to you, because PF patients may experience a hypoxic state when they're short of oxygen, where the brain and other organs can be affected. Do you know of any studies that discuss the power of negative or positive self-talk that may affect different parts of the brain, like the frontal lobe, the hippocampus, the amygdala, any of those?
There's a lot in that question, right? So your point about the exposure to a chronic hypoxic state, so a chronic state with too little oxygen, is really a good one. It makes it imperative, and I'm not saying this to you guys, that this is nothing you don't already know, the importance of addressing the cognitive and the mood components of your experience. It's so important because you have to address this chronic hypoxic condition. So there is a lot of great research looking at things like mindfulness and meditation, bringing on, without going too far afield, but maybe some of you are like my kind of geeky people. So there are different kinds of brain waves, and we use brain waves to track wakefulness and cognitive function, and then also to assess sleep. And the kinds of brain waves that are associated with stage 1 and stage 2 sleep, they're called theta waves, are actually the brain waves that are associated also with a mindful meditative state. So particularly in the frontal lobe. So people who are really expert, and there may be some of you, and I'm hoping you can share your experience at using a mindful meditative break, we're talking 5 minutes a day, are really tuning down the frequency in their brain, right? They're like allowing the brain to recharge for all intents and purposes. And if you think of the frontal lobe as the part of the brain that is interestingly, it's sense of humor in extroverts. That's where sense of humor lives in extroverts. In introverts, sense of humor lives in the amygdala, strangely. But if you think of the frontal lobe as the part of your brain that is ruminative, it's the part of your brain that is running through all the catastrophic scenarios and running through all of the things that could happen if the worst case scenario were to unfold. It's the fuel for your panic response. So your amygdala is just a stupid button, right? It just turns on and off, but it's your frontal lobe that fuels that fire. So if you can learn to quiet your frontal lobe on demand, you have tremendous control over all of these other processes in your brain.
Well, so a 5-minute mindfulness break can help all of our brains. That's good news. We all have 5 minutes. So, but how does prolonged emotional, psychological stress affect the brain? You know, when you don't do your mindfulness break and you get strung out.
Yeah. So here's a really important thing is, as we talk about our emerging understanding of the brain, what we know is, and this is different, what I love about neuroscience is that I teach this every quarter, and then let's say I'll teach it again right now in the spring, and I'll have to revise my lectures because some of what I taught in the fall will be totally irrelevant. So a lot of you will remember a time when we said, like, the one thing we know about the brain is that we don't grow new neurons, right? That was like the bedrock of our understanding of the brain. And then we came to realize, like, oh, actually, that's not true. And on postmortem dissection, we see all these immature neurons in older adult brains. Like, well, that's strange. Where would those have come from? And then we figure out, like, oh, interesting. You can grow new neurons over the course of your lifetime. And there's really 3 places where you grow new neurons. And the other way of maintaining a healthy brain is to branch out the neurons that you have. So we call it arborization, or like to make more branching in the dendrites. A lot of you remember from science the neuron, and the dendrites are the communication end. So for arborization, so dendritic branching and neurogenesis, there's really a hub. There's 3 areas, but the hub really is in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is in our temporal lobe, so it's just inside from our ears on either side. And the hippocampus is like a little bulb of tissue whose role is, we used to think, just in the consolidation of memory. But interestingly, what we also see now is that the hippocampus is the most plastic part of the brain. So you see tremendous hippocampal volume change in response to the events of a lifetime. So for example, you see a smaller hippocampus in people who are chronically stressed, for example. You also see, and these can be used diagnostically as gold standard in fMRI studies, you also see less hippocampal volume and less hippocampal activity in chronic depression, in exposure to childhood trauma, in people who have PTSD, for example. And not surprisingly, you see a tremendous overlap in the clinical presentation in all of those states, right? Stress and hypervigilance and overreactivity. So the way that we can gauge the effectiveness of antidepressant interventions is looking at the degree to which you see a rebound or a restoration in hippocampal volume. If you think of like all roads lead to Rome, and Rome is restoring hippocampal volume loss. And the practical benefit of hippocampal volume loss, we now understand to be better mood, but also all of the cognitive components, right? So the way that we think of cognitive slowing associated with depression, and we tell people a story about, well, this is all in your head. Of course, it's not in your head, imaginary, but it actually is in your brain, right? This is related to volume loss. So this is actually neuronal loss in the hippocampus. So everything we're going to talk about today, so sleep, improving mood, mindful meditation, physical movement, these are all ways to restore hippocampal volume. So it's a healthy, supple, beautiful brain.
That's fantastic. And we do have a question that came in. Do the side effects of drugs, such as reduced blood counts, white blood count, red blood count, higher creatine levels, higher blood sugar, affect cognitive function? And what things can we do to address cognitive function?
This is an excellent question. And Cyril, do I see you? Oh, I see you right there. Cyril, you're in the middle of my screen. What a great question. So the first part, there's kind of a 2-part answer to that question. So one thing about the brain is that it's relatively self-contained. So there's less direct impact for things like white blood cell, neutrophil, red blood cell in the circulating vascular system relative to the brain. So provided the brain is getting enough oxygen and glucose for the glial cells to pick up. But the piece of your question that is really directly related to brain function is higher blood sugar. So one of the greatest risks for longer-term brain disease is associated with chronic exposure to high blood sugar. So you want to be, that's the piece of your question that is like, that warrants the most attention for reasons that we don't completely understand. And it could be related to a hypermetabolic state. It could be related to like fuel consumption, but for reasons we're not entirely sure of, this like chronic hyperglycemic state is the negative of these others, right? So your increase in circulating levels of neutrophils or white blood cells, for example, may have very little effect on cognition. We just recently learned about the brain's own immune system, right? It's the glymph system. So those white blood cells really shouldn't have any interaction, right? Sometimes if your blood-brain barrier is leaky, they can, and that poses a whole host of other problems. But otherwise, circulating red and white blood cells won't have any interaction at all with the brain, but blood sugar does. Yeah.
You had mentioned the other day that not only is there a leaky gut bacteria issue, but leaky brain. So could you touch base on that while we're on this subject?
Yeah. So this is part of my body of research, is looking at brain injury and disease, like long-term risk for dementing disease, for example. And so we do a lot of research on younger athletes. We do a lot of research on NCAA college athletes. We have a whole population of older retired athletes. So we're trying to track the risk of exposure to, in this case, brain injury on brain health. So the really interesting thing, and a lot of you know this body of research better than I do, but this emerging understanding of the brain in our gut, we call it the enteric nervous system, or some people call it the intrinsic nervous system, with the discovery that in the lining of our small intestine, there are more serotonergic or serotonin producing, serotonin responsive neurons in the lining of our small intestine than there are in the brain. And we've always thought of serotonin as the principal neurotransmitter of things like mood and cognition. So to appreciate, like, oh, isn't that so strange? There's more of those in our gut than there are in our actual central nervous system. So our understanding of the role of this enteric nervous system is growing over time. So there's a really cool body of research, and we'll talk a little bit about nutrition. I'm going to talk about inflammation, and then we'll talk about nutrition as being one of the footholds in managing chronic inflammation. But I joke to my students that the research on the enteric nervous system is so interesting that it makes me want to apologize to every nutritionist that I've ever rolled my eyes at. And some of you may have had that experience of the well-intended nutritionist, and I don't know what it is. They're so smart, but it, like, that field pulls for people who are particularly fanatical. And I find myself like, oh my God, okay, I just want to know, when is it going to be okay to eat Doritos? Like, that's the only question that I have.
It's okay to eat Doritos.
Drink a beer, surely there's something.
Exactly, right? Like, it just never seems to map onto like the life that you want to lead. But anyway, they're probably onto something all along. So this gut microbiome and the enteric nervous system probably play a much larger role in mood and cognition than we even imagine.
Oh.
So there's that piece. And then there's this idea of the blood-brain barrier. We think of it as impermeable, so that things cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is just collectively the walls of the capillaries in the vasculature that is in the central nervous system. So it's not like, a filter or, some anatomical structure. It's just that the walls of those capillaries are more tightly bound together than is true, let's say, for your skin, where part of your leaky capillaries there are designed so that you can maintain your body temperature, right? So that you could sweat. So interestingly, those membranes are fatty membranes. So things that are dissolvable in fat can cross the blood-brain barrier, but things that are water soluble cannot without help. So things like sugar, for example, is water soluble. So it needs insulin and fatty acids to get it across the blood-brain barrier. What we know is true, though, after brain injury, so even a mild concussive injury, is that one of the physiological effects of brain injury is that you have a leaky, transiently permeable blood-brain barrier for a short period of time. And interestingly, that period of leaky blood-brain barrier seems to map on pretty cleanly to the experience of symptoms. So some people have a blood-brain barrier that closes back up inside of 7 days, and that's the period of time where they're symptomatic from their concussion. And for reasons we don't fully understand, some people have a chronically leaky blood-brain barrier. And if your blood-brain barrier is leaky, your brain gets exposed to all kinds of things, like Cyril's question around white blood cells, right? The brain should have nothing to do with circulating white blood cells, but if it's leaky, it sure does. And then you have this aggravated inflammatory response in the brain. So from a clinical management perspective, there's a lot of research on medications in the short term, immediately after injury, whose sole purpose is to shut down the blood-brain barrier. So recognizing that it will be leaky and to shut down that barrier. My colleague, I was telling this story to Shelley and Bill, that one of our research partners, we have the Denver Broncos on our research team, and their neurosurgeon, Chad Prusmack, is part of our research team. And his management of any injury, even a mild injury for his professional players, is to immediately shut down the blood-brain barrier and the gut barrier. So his model is that it's actually exposure to gut bacteria in the brain that produces all of the mood and cognitive and other related post-concussive symptoms that we think of as kind of the traditional, like, well, this is just a product of injury, but he's finding if he can shut it down in real time, that he could prevent athletes from being symptomatic. So
what are those medications that shut that down?
Good question. So some steroid medications will shut it down, right? Yeah. Yep. Which you might use, we might reserve, like methylprednisolone, for example, for swelling. But in this case, you're not going to have brain swelling from a concussive injury, right? These are milder injuries, but using heavier doses of steroids for that purpose does the trick and seems to prevent the sequela of injury.
Would you like to talk more on, since you brought up the ideas of nutrition and inflammation before we go into some self-soothing strategies? And
yeah, I love that. So in the study of the brain, so this is true for brain injury, it's study in my work with, it's true for the study of chronic illness, inflammation, and this is your world, you know this better than anyone. Inflammation is really a double-edged sword, right? We need to have a robust inflammatory response so that we can navigate our environment and have a robust healing response. If we cut our skin or we're exposed to an environmental pathogen, right? We're alive because we have an inflammatory response. So it's kind of, it's inherent in day-to-day function is that our inflammatory system is robust. The other side, though, of that double-edged sword is chronic inflammation. And if you think of chronic inflammation is the root of everything that goes sideways about physiologic function. And then all of the downstream effects of that. So for example, lung disease and fibrotic lung tissue, depression, cancer, the explosion of the proliferation of cancer cells, the accumulation of plaque in the brain that is associated with Alzheimer's disease, right? Like if you zoom back up the timeline, it's all chronic inflammation at its root. So this, there's like a whole body of research on aging that calls aging is inflammaging, right? That it's actually aging is the accumulation of chronic inflammatory damage. So there's a lot of research on inflammation. What I've been really glad to see wearing my psychologist hat is a growing understanding of depression as a chronic inflammatory condition. We're understanding better the other kinds of chronic inflammatory conditions, like, for example, is true in a flare-up of PF, right? That's the exacerbation of chronic inflammation. So if your intervention treats inflammation, you are treating all of these other downstream conditions. So we know, and thank goodness for job security, things like psychotherapy actually treat inflammation. So it reduces chronic inflammation and does two things, right? It reduces the production of the kinds of molecules that promote inflammation, and it supports the production of the kinds of molecules that quiet inflammation. So anti-inflammatory cytokines. There are And that's a kind of chronic long-term endeavor that I think everybody should know is available to them. And we'll talk about some of the points at which you might recognize, like, hey, I need another set of eyes on this problem and I could use some help. So that's the kind of help that can yield this anti-inflammatory benefit. But then there's the other day-to-day, short-term kinds of things that you can do. Nutrition is one of the big ones to promote an anti-inflammatory response in your day-to-day life, which will help to manage mood, fuzzy cognition. You'll sleep better. If you have any kind of chronic pain, it reduces the experience of chronic pain, right? Remembering that those three things are inextricably linked together. So nutrition is one of the really easy ones, right? This is how we're designed to be exposed to anti-inflammatory benefit. Shelley, I see you're muted.
I didn't want you to hear the dog barking, but anyway, yes, I mentioned to you the other day, and a lot of PF patients probably don't know this either. Well, they know that reflux, can get into the lungs and damage the lungs, but also the University of Denver is doing a study on gum bacteria. If people don't take care of their teeth, and especially if you're going to eat sugar and carbohydrates, those are the things that can kind of pack onto your teeth a little bit better. Those they are studying to see whether that bacteria can migrate into your lungs like it migrates into your heart.
Yep.
So this whole thing about bacteria is very serious, and probably, what you're eating and how you're keeping all of these ports into your body clean.
That's right. That's right. It's like everything that the dentists have been saying all along, the science has finally caught up to them to say, like, you know what? All right, fine, we'll floss.
Oh, yeah.
You're right. I guess you're right. That's how I think about with nutritionists. Like, okay, you were right. It really is leafy green vegetables. Fine. Okay. But on the nutrition side with anti-inflammatory, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? This is the stuff that, your healthcare team would encourage you to eat. Hopefully you guys will find a way to eat them that doesn't gross you out. I have a joke that I feel like my German heritage means that I hate all vegetables, which makes it particularly taxing for me to find ways to get enough leafy green vegetables. I don't know that that has anything to do with being German, but I joke that it's a German thing.
Well, so aside from being German, what are the good, bad anti-inflammatory foods and diet?
Excellent. So foods have anti-inflammatory and antioxidative properties to the degree that they're saturated with color. So we used to think of those as like dark colors, like kale and spinach got a lot of attention. But now we understand that it really is just the degree to which the pigment is present throughout the food. So things like cauliflower, for example, where the white pigment is present throughout the whole flower, has a lot of anti-inflammatory and antioxidative properties. So there are rating scales. It's the oxidative radical absorbance capacity, or ORAC. There is an ORAC scale for all foods. So, if you have some favorites, you could look up the ORAC numbers for all of those foods and kind of plot your day and see what might be higher on the list that you could add into your day-to-day diet. What's really interesting, though, is there's an emerging body of research looking at the role of fatty acids. So we know that omega-3, omega-6 fatty acids are really beneficial. We've always known that they're beneficial for brain health. We know that they're beneficial for cardiovascular health. Interestingly, no one's ever known, like, well, what the heck is it that those fatty acids even do? That seems kind of ridiculous. We know that the brain, for example, will use fatty acids as fuel, but beyond that, it hasn't really been clear. So what's really interesting, and this is emerging in the field of Alzheimer's research, is the study of these chemical compounds that are called resolvins. like resolve, V-I-N-S, resolvins. And these are compounds whose metabolic property is to resolve inflammation. And they're found from a dietary perspective, they're found in omega fatty acids. So one of the principal properties, the healthful benefits of omega fatty acids might be these resolvin molecules that address chronic inflammation, that support the resolution of chronic inflammation. So the study of resolvins in Alzheimer's disease is totally taking off. It's one of the 2 leading clinical trials, is medications that include resolvin treatment. So that's kind of a game changer in the field of brain science and aging brain and aging healthfully. And it increases our understanding of why fatty acids have some physiologic benefit. Of course, depending on where you get your fatty acids, the best case scenario is from cold water fish. And the kind of least best case scenario is from a tablet that you pick up at the grocery store. And if you, like me, are relying on the tablets in lieu of sardines, let's say, then you have to be really careful that you're choosing well, because there's research that some of those don't include any omega-3 fatty acids, these like PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids. And worse, there's research that some of them contain more harmful compounds. So you have to be really careful if you're relying on supplements like that. But ideally, you have a diet that's rich in things like fish. Kale and spinach also have a lot of fatty acids in them. One of the other things that shows up on the fatty acid list is eels. I always joke that it's like I'm the worst possible nutritionist, where my recommendations are like that you have kale and eels. Like, okay, who is going to follow this? No one is ever going to follow those directions. But anyway, we could be smart about it, right? This is a way of biohacking. Like, okay, I'm going to make a point to add sardines into my Caesar salad dressing, and I'm going to massage the heck out of the kale so that it's not so darn chewy. And I'm going to have a Caesar salad once a day. Easy.
Well, actually, we grow a lot of those things in our garden. So we're
Kelly, that's great.
I don't know the eel, but so we're talking about the diet, nutrition. Since you're up there working with all those major athletes, what we're missing is maybe talking a little bit about the role of exercise and physical health on brain and depression.
Yeah, this is huge. And I tell my students this, I tell everybody that I work with, that I will spend my entire career looking for some kind of physiological justification for watching Netflix and eating Doritos. You can see I really love Doritos. So like if I could find some rationale that those 2 things had some health benefit, then my work here is done. But so far, of course, there isn't. And sadly, it's just not the case that either of those aren't terrible for you.
Yeah.
So exercise, I use that word with like air quotes around it. So what people hear when you use the word exercise is, some kind of visual, mental image of a triathlon, or this is someone who is training to run a marathon, or this is someone who spends hours a day doing something with their heart rate up. And what's really interesting is that in the research, exercise is operationalized as an increased heart rate for 60 seconds at a time. So especially in a lot of these animal models. So when I talk about exercise, I talk about like whatever movement, and I do a lot of work with folks with chronic illness and disability in particular. So the word exercise is loaded already, right? Where people are like, that's just not possible for me. Like, my body doesn't work in the same way. It doesn't look like yours, and it doesn't function like yours. So everything that some physical therapist is going to recommend is going to fall flat. So it's whatever gets your heart rate up for 60 seconds at a time. So it might be arm raises, it might be leg dips, it may be, if you have the luxury of a body that gives you jumping jacks, it may be jumping jacks for 60 seconds at a time. It may be, right, like doing a deep knee bend on your way from, right, like one room into the next. So I think we do such a disservice in the larger kind of health service field to talk about exercise as something that is unattainable, when if you look at the actual research and break it down, like, this is kind of easy stuff, and it's not the kind of thing that isn't available in some way to all of us. And this is like against everything that I wish were true. The gold standard way to restore hippocampal volume is cardiovascular activity, like hard stop, period. Like, it's just that simple. That's the fastest, most effective way to grow new neurons and to promote arborization, right? That kind of dendritic branching is 60 seconds at a time of elevated heart rate.
Wow.
Yeah.
That does sound doable.
Yeah. Yep.
It's very important for pulmonary fibrosis patients to get the exercise. I remember, when my husband was first diagnosed, I was so afraid he would have to be in bed. I'd have to do all his medicine and bring all his medicine, not let him do anything. And one of the nurses said, do not let him sit around or lay around. He has got to be up. He's got to be, moving his big leg muscles to get that blood oxygen thing.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I'll keep him moving. So,
Shelley,
my whole view of being a caregiver changed that moment.
So sweeping the floor, mopping,
I
loading the dishwasher, dusting.
we got to mute somebody.
It's loading the dishwasher and dusting for sure. Shelley, what I love about your point, though, is speaking to for the experience of the patient. For a lot of folks, it's really scary to exercise and to feel more out of breath and more winded, and to feel your breath get away from you can be really scary. And people develop a kind of conditioned avoidance to any kind of cardiovascular activity. And that becomes this really vicious downward spiral where, right, like you're losing, think of the physiology, you're losing that brain volume and the part of your brain that controls mood and cognition. So it's whatever it takes. And we can do a lot of that in our day-to-day activity. I love the point about loading and unloading the dishwasher, and that a little bit more vigorously is as simple as it gets.
Well, I've got 4 dogs here we're taking care of, but it just reminded me of something like when I walk the dogs. Actually, that's exactly how they exercise. They run for 60 seconds.
That's so true.
Something or do something, and they run. And I'm like, this isn't giving me the best exercise, but actually it is. So
it is. Actually, you mentioned this. This is just a little interesting sidebar on the research on aging brains. So in the mouse model research, they break out 4-leg, like 4-paw exercise versus hind leg exercise. And like the analog is for people, it's like upper body versus lower body. And it's the hind leg exercise that confers a benefit to the mice. So that's been kind of like, you mentioned it, Shelley, that it shows up in these kind of like anecdotal, it's leg exercise, but it really is like an interesting little, an artifact of these mouse models, is that it's hind leg research that confers a benefit. So for reasons that nobody's really understanding yet. Is it because of blood flow? Is it, right, a circulatory benefit that ultimately confers the advantage? Who knows? But getting your legs in there in some way, everywhere possible, is a good thing.
yes. And remember, folks, you all can ask questions. It doesn't have to just be me because I can talk all day, unfortunately. All right, well, let's go into the area of strategies to self-soothe because, like I mentioned, so many PF patients really do think, what did I do to cause this disease?
Yep.
What did I do wrong? Can I, I can't undo it. And,
Yep.
and they beat themselves up and, how do you reduce that negative noise that we all have for whatever reason?
Yeah. One part of that is I mentioned the frontal lobe, which is the most recently evolved part of our brain as a species. It's also the most recently matured part of our brain. It only matured for all of us, right? Looking around, it's not been that long ago for most of you. Probably around the time we hit 30. So this is it's an immature part of our brain. That said, it also is a real foil. So it's the part of our brain that allows us to forecast consequences and to see 3 or 4 steps into the future and to imagine what the outcomes might be, for better or worse. So it's also the part of your brain that, like I said, is ruminative. It's the part of our brain that gets stuck in this loop of catastrophizing and all the ways that what's this going to look like for me 2 weeks from now, a year from now? Things are going to be so much worse, right? It's like we're all of the kinds of negative self-talk that for a lot of folks, when we talk about sleep disturbance, a lot of folks have a kind of primary insomnia, which is trouble falling asleep at night. And a lot of folks have primary insomnia because of this soundtrack in their head, right? That is like this incessant loop of all of the things that have gone wrong and that could go wrong and that are destined to go wrong at some point, all of the ways that you've screwed it up for yourself, right? Like this really toxic self-talk that is in all the ways that we've said, right, that ultimately is undermining your physical health. So there are a lot of ways to quiet that. And I mentioned that mindful meditation is a really easy way to do that. And one of the ways that I love to suggest and to use mindfulness is to use it as part of sleep hygiene. And sleep hygiene is really the gold standard for addressing good sleep. And one of the things that is the hallmark of sleep hygiene is this transition from wakefulness to sleep. And a really lovely thing to insert right there is a mindful meditation, because the transition should be marked by theta waves on an EEG. And we know that mindful meditation can elicit theta waves. So the other thing that it does is it engages your brain so that you're not just like this passive listener to all of the ways that your life has gone off the rails. So you get to harness the cognitive activity for good, right? So whether it's concentrating, doing a body scan, concentrating on where your tension is, whether it's like training yourself to just watch your thoughts go by as like clouds in the sky, right? Whichever mindful meditation paradigm you use, it's really easy to embed that for 5+ minutes at bedtime every night. And the benefits are really pretty stunning, right? If you can facilitate this transition from wakefulness into stage 1, stage 2 sleep, you've already fixed half of the problem, right? That's where I think 70% of folks have a primary insomnia. Of folks who have insomnia complaints, their problem is falling asleep. So mindfulness plugs in really neatly there. You could plug it in during the daytime. A lot of folks say like, I don't have time to meditate during the day. I'm caring for my family and my partner has PF and they require a lot of my time. I talk about doing toilet meditation. So the 60 seconds that you have by yourself where you can close a bathroom door, right? Especially if you have younger kids in your household, right? That may be the only luxury of time you have to yourself. So it's wherever you can fit it in. And it's really A, restorative for the brain, and B, imparts this sense of mastery over frontal lobe function.
That's amazing. Well, I do have some questions. One is, what about using melatonin? What about how about the difference between Eastern styles with low protein, more vegetables, and exercise? I guess that is more of a statement that is more mindfulness. Yeah, I mean, because you hear here, and I probably with all those athletes you work with, they have such a high protein diet and mindfulness meditation certainly. So any comments on amount of protein?
Boy, this is where I have to like turn to my nutrition colleagues to weigh in. There are ways that it's got to be sustainable. So for a lot of us, right, going a kind of pure all-in keto or paleo diet is going to work with a lifestyle. And there are a lot of folks who are going to feel constantly undermined by cravings and the ways that their life gets in the way, which is ultimately worse, because then you, I'm going to use the word relapse, but would relapse to foods outside of the ones that you've been prescribed or required to eat. Then you feel bad about yourself and it becomes this kind of self-punishing cycle, which is ultimately worse than the food you were eating in the first place. So it's a healthy balance, and it's finding this sustainable balance and having a conversation with someone that you trust who has the expertise to weigh in, like what kind of protein ratio should I have? Am I no carbs at all? Am I low carbs, high fat? Which of these models is ultimately going to serve your health well? And paying attention to it is going to yield the change, right? Being kind of thoughtful about what you put into your body. It's as simple as that. And trying to add as many of those high ORAC foods as possible, recognizing like the end game should be to reduce chronic inflammation. So add as many ORAC vegetables, fruits and vegetables as possible. Shelley, you did mention this from one of the questions. One of my favorite things to talk about is melatonin. And here, you all know mine is a PhD, not an MD. So this should not be construed as if I'm offering medical advice. But one of the things that I always do is in any of our laboratory contexts, I'm always watching like, well, what do my other colleagues, what supplements do they take? And what do they do? Like, here's the people who are running the mice lab looking at dementing disease or whatever. Like, okay, well, what is it that they make a point of eating? And you'll see it's things like, my neuroscience, traditional wet lab neuroscience colleagues make a point of eating a cup of blueberries every day. And it's always like fish oil, and somebody actually drinks the fish oil, blah. But anyway, so there's like that piece. And the other thing that you see to a person is that every one of them takes melatonin. And what's so interesting about melatonin, it is like kind of defies some of the contemporary wisdom in some ways, and is really interesting in other ways. So first of all, melatonin is a really potent anti-inflammatory and antioxidant. So it has this neuroprotective benefit as a substance. And the bioavailability of melatonin tends to be fairly high, which is not true of a lot of supplements. So it has that benefit. Interestingly, this is like the gold standard for drug administration, is that if you supplement with some kind of, we call it exogenous substance, over time, your body, right, nature hates waste, so you'll produce less of the endogenous of the version of that substance, right? And this is true for, abusing amphetamines and cocaine, for example, but also things like, histamines and all of, right, any drug of abuse, right? That's true, is you develop a tolerance because you produce less of that, whatever the endogenous substance is. It does not appear to be true, however, for melatonin, which is produced by the pineal gland. So it does not appear to be true that supplementing the body's production of melatonin with exogenous or melatonin tablets reduces melatonin production in the brain, which is really interesting. And it may be because the pineal gland produces melatonin in the darkness. So there's kind of a natural variability in how much and when we're exposed to darkness. So, right, maybe the body is kind of primed for variable production anyway. So all of that to say, it has neuroprotective benefits. For people for whom it works, it produces restful sleep, and it can shorten the window between the time that your head hits the pillow and the time that you hit stage 1, stage 2 sleep, right? The period of time where your frontal lobe is going like gangbusters. A lot of people aren't particularly sensitive to melatonin, so they can take it and it makes no difference at all. And some people can't tolerate it at all, right? It's like taking 20 Ambien. So some people have to be really careful with it. But your pineal gland produces melatonin in the darkness, so it's designed to make you feel sleepy. Interestingly, one of the things that your pineal gland responds to is blue light, so the kind of frequency that is daylight. So the screen that you have at night in your bed, television or your phone or iPad, is suppressing melatonin production. So a lot of people, right, if they can't quite get the sleep hygiene habit of leaving devices out of the bedroom, melatonin can give you a little bit of a head start because you've suppressed your own melatonin production. The easier way to do it is to just not be exposed to blue light at nighttime and instead to be exposed to darkness. But I think that it's like the most interesting little easy biohack, and it's really chiefly available to us here in the US, because if you go to most other countries and you look for melatonin, it's a controlled substance there. So if you go to Europe and you go to a pharmacy and ask for melatonin, it would be like walking up to a counter and asking for OxyContin. Right? It'd be like, you can't just get that here, right? And we think like, oh my God, it's melatonin. It's like at the health food store and it's in the grocery aisle.
How funny.
Yeah.
What about
So we should take advantage of it, and it has really profound health benefits.
we do take that. Well, how would taking probiotics, help the microbiome and all this too?
Yeah, there's a lot of research on the kinds of interventions to manipulate the gut microbiome, and as of right now, that research is really pretty mixed. And there's a field of study on psychobiotics. So these are interventions designed to promote a gut biome that is mentally healthier. So these kind of psychobiotics. That includes a diet rich in things like protein, for all the reasons that we've said. Because protein has the building blocks for things like serotonin. So tyrosine, for example, is one of the amino acid building blocks for serotonin, which we get chiefly from protein. So there's a lot of interesting work on psychobiotic interventions, but it's really hard to know what a microbiome is supposed to be. So attempts to manipulate it, it's unclear, right? Because it's the most unique feature from one human being to the next, right? More unique even than mitochondrial DNA. And it's also not clear how to intervene in a way that doesn't unintentionally create an overpopulation of bad bacteria, right? So there's a really delicate balance. The research on prebiotics, though, is much more robust. So the research to suggest that if you can feed healthy bacteria, so give healthy bacteria the kinds of exposed to the kinds of nutrients that they proliferate with, that you actually have better outcomes. So the that probiotic, and of course, things like lactobacillus and things in yogurt are obviously very good for you. That's a good bacteria, but it's not clear, like, should you eat yogurt 10 times a day? Is it enough to have it once a week? There's just no great standardized research. There's much better research on exposure to prebiotics. And those are things bacteria like to munch on, like things like cellulose, and another plug for leafy greens there, right? Fiber, healthy gut bacteria love to eat things like fiber and cellulose. So it's, if you think of things that are these categories of like, oh, that's come up a few times, right? Sleep will come up several times. Mindfulness will come up several times. And this anti-inflammatory, thoughtful way of eating also comes up all the time.
Some dogs barking in the background. I apologize, but we talked the other day also about some apps that you know about that might help with all of the things that we're talking about, self-soothing, and I do want to get into resilience too.
Yeah. And Shelley, I'll share this list with you. It's there's great resources. So I have great colleagues at NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and they rate every year all of the commercially available apps. So NAMI has a great list. I think Oprah's magazine has a list every year, right? Like everybody rates all of the commercially available apps out there. And some of them are free, some of them are monthly fees, some of them have a one-time purchase fee, some are free, but then all the actual functions are embedded behind a paywall, which is a little bit cheeky. But you may recognize some of those terms. So Calm is one. Interestingly, Calm and Headspace are two of the more popular apps. And in a way that I thought was like, finally, a software developer feels a call to social justice. They both made their software free for the length of the pandemic. So it was like, oh, like using their tech prowess for good. There's also Buddhify is a really interesting one. So someone had mentioned this kind of Eastern philosophy, and there are a lot of apps that are more traditionalist in that way, that really are more about, right, selfhood and finding the context of your selfhood in the universe. And it's like if that is a fit for your sensibility, there is an app where you can find it. So Buddhify and Prana Breath are two that are that have a little bit more of that Eastern. There's also breathing apps, which can be really helpful for people with lung disease, not because you don't know how to breathe. In fact, I would argue that you're breath experts in ways that app developers never will be, but because the mastery of breathing can be really useful, a really useful skill to use across settings. So if you find yourself winded and feeling a little bit panicky about it, relying on breath training can be a really great short-term intervention. So there's a few, iBreathe and Breathe Plus are two apps that are just designed to do breathing training. So those are also great resources. So, and Shelley, I'll send you this whole list of great ones.
Okay. Well, back to resilience now. We have been through almost a year of hunkering down. Our community already knew to sort of distance yourself from people and watch where you're going, don't get in crowds. I mean, we were already up the curve on a lot of things you need to do to stay healthy and, stay away from germs. But this has been a long time. And, also our patients who get into the lung transplant programs, they have to go through a lot. And, sometimes somebody will call and say, we've got your lung, and it's from somebody who was on drugs or in prison. Do you want this set of lungs? And, so being able to come back from highs and lows, and our community is, it's not always easy to do that. So maybe resilience training is a helpful thing for us to know too.
Yeah, I think everybody on this call, what's so special about the PF Warriors is that you really built a commodity of resilience, and it's the thing that you share with each other and that you share with your members, and that you've managed to broker for people. And part of that is hopefulness and community and having a kind of a robust safety net, but it's resilience that you already do so well. And people with chronic illness, and looking at every one of you here, me too, like there is a way that you don't have a choice not to be resilient. So would you prefer the chance to kind of curl up in a ball and hang it up maybe from day to day, but it's not a luxury that any of you have, right? So you've had to dig deep in a way that the general population who hasn't experienced any of that adversity really cannot even imagine. So there is research studying people with chronic illness to study, well, what is it with that accounts for survival with a chronic illness, right? Why is it that some people outlive a marker that their doctor gave them for reasons, right? Like what sets one person apart from the next? And right, like looking at the faces here, it's every single one of you. So all that to say, the research wants to study you to find out the answer to this question. The other piece of this, though, is resilience is probably mastery, and it's probably a sense of feeling like you can get the sleep that you need. It's probably a sense that you can shut off the ruminative self-talk when you need to. It's probably the experience of being able to manage chronic pain, to manage chronic breathlessness, for example, right? There's an element of resilience that is power, right? Feeling some mastery or power over your circumstances, and appreciating where your power comes from and where to take it. And do you have power over lung physiology? Only part of it, but are you going to exploit the part of the control that you have? You bet. And you already do that. And there's a way that it's there. I can give you tools to hack your way into doing that even more effectively, but it's what every one of you is already doing.
Well, I do that. I'm not gifted in the area of technology. I have to keep reminding myself I have other gifts and talents. Telling my husband, but I do this well, so anyway.
Yep.
Okay, so we've got about 20 minutes left of your time, and I need some questions from the audience, and I want Alice and Joe Malik to think about something for a moment, because I know you all are going through the lung transplant workup process, and I wondered if there's anything that you've had to work on mentally or emotionally to keep yourselves focused. Is that something? All right, let me unmute Alice, if I can. Can you unmute? There, okay, she's unmuted. Yep. All right. You have a...
Well, wow, you put me on the spot.
No, I hate to do it, but I thought...
Thank you very much.
You've really got you've got wonderful depth and quality, and you already know so much. So anyway,
Gosh.
But yeah, how's that process going for you?
Okay, well, we're right on the edge of hearing that news, that phone call that the transplant committee, decision committee, is going to put him on the list. So, I think how I've tried to envision, we call it a journey, and I tried to envision it as a road trip. And we're on bumpy roads, and sometimes we take side trips. And right now, we've got kind of a respite period where we just have one more test to do this next week. And we're kind of just taking the side trip in the country, and we're relaxing. And my cousin she lives in upstate New York where I grew up, and she just sent me a great fuel for visual. She and her dad went to a pond and saw 16 tundra swans, and they just sat and watched them. And so I immediately looked up a picture of a tundra swan, and there it was, beautiful, white, and spectacular. So I put that in my visual. We're on this country trip and looking at some swans. Taking one day at a time is paramount.
Get back in the car if you get bumped out.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, taking one day at a time. Don't try to imagine what the future is going to be, and make every day count.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Remarkable. Extraordinary. Alice, if someone could have recorded that and have that to play at night as their fall asleep message, it's extraordinary. And that you see yourself as the car and not the road. That's the difference. That's what resilience is. Yeah, kudos and good luck. Sending really good thoughts for good test results.
And we did have a comment and a question come in. The comment part is one can tune nutrition to your metrics for high blood pressure, eat 90 grams of carbs, not counting vegetables, amount of fat, French fries, drives the tacrolimus absorption levels. I don't know what that is. One must do it holistically with knowledge. Question, we know about exercise and nutrition, but why do some of us do it and others do not? Similar to wearing masks. Oh, what a great question. Similar to wearing masks, is there a difference between the brains of ability or upbringing? Wow.
Yeah. It's that latter one is so loaded, right?
Is that the amygdala gone wild, or what's going on? This is, and I'm sharing my frustration, which is not at all unlike what you guys experience. The isolation experienced by people with chronic illness is unprecedented in this context. And to have been isolated socially and physically since, for a lot of people, February, March of this year, and looking at a runway of time that for many of us includes an entire year from now, and thinking about, are you going to be in the queue for a vaccine? Are you eligible for a vaccine? A lot of folks who are immunocompromised won't have the opportunity to take advantage of vaccine trials. And it's not been studied really well in people with chronic illnesses. So, even the conversation, the larger popular media conversation about a vaccine and things are going to change in January is not the kind of message that people with chronic illness have. And it's not their world right now. This is not your experience. So on the research side, we did a lot of research in the SARS era to look at people who were holed up in their homes when SARS was the thing. And literally that research was 3 months long. And that seemed like an era. It was like, oh my God, people are isolated in their homes for 3 months at a time. And we've blown that out of the water, right? Like we passed that marker in the spring. So we don't know anything about where we are and the psychological effects and the long-term effects. And we're really kind of figuring it out as we go, how to support each other. And the importance of the PF Warrior community has never been more vital than it is now. So it is so hard. And I see people without masks being cavalier, and there's nothing that makes me angrier than that. And I'm sure that's true for a lot of you too, to think like for people who would give anything
to have the chance to be out in the world or to be, right, like flitting around Hobby Lobby without a mask on is a luxury that you don't have. And for people to be flip about it and to politicize it is just, I think, disgusting. So
yeah, I can imagine anybody in the healthcare industry, certainly everybody in our community wears a mask. We can't risk it at all, but for the.
And you can't imagine, or like, how is that a political statement? You guys are thinking like, I'd give anything to be the person who could go without a mask and be at the store at my friend's house or in a crowded restaurant or go to a party or see my grandkids or whatever, right? Like for someone to be so cavalier about the health and safety of themselves and others is really mind-boggling.
That was a wonderful question. Any other questions, folks? Let me see here. I don't see it.
I love Henry's question with social media. It is a really difficult balance with social media, and it looks like we just lost Henry. I'm sure he'll be coming right back. He's probably going to like sign into social media as we're talking about it. Social media has never been a better way to stay connected virtually, right? This is, you think about how our lives would be different if we tried to hold something like this 20 years ago, right? It would be, are we all on speakerphone and figuring it out? And, the half of people who can't figure out mute are ruining it for everyone else. Like it just is horrifying. But the downside of social media is we have to be really conscious of this being battered by this kind of high intensity, high volume news cycle that is relentless, 24 hours. It's designed to be provocative. And my suggestions around, using social media to be kind of thoughtful. Sorry, as the phone is ringing in the background, guys. My suggestions are to think about it like you do nutrition and the food that you put into your body. You should have the same thoughtfulness around social media and your consumables. So what do you want to consume and what outlets will you follow? And is there an emotional cost to rolling through Facebook updates? And for a lot of us, right, there's a lot of really awful updates on Facebook, and recognizing when you need to step away from that. And it's, we have to be so mindful about it. It's not just, the kind of innocuous background noise. Now it's front and center, and it drives the information we have and our understanding of, what the world is doing. And it can be really anxiety producing because it's designed to do that, right? Like news wants to capture your attention and elicit a visceral response. And to the degree that it does that, it's more successful and you stay tuned in and you click through more and advertisers make more money. We have to be smarter than the advertisers think we are.
Yeah, well, I kind of like the idea of taking melatonin because, I know I shouldn't look at Facebook before
I know at nighttime.
Friends are doing or saying, but I do, and there's that blue light, and so maybe.
Yeah, Shelley, that's right on. The easiest thing to do is to cut that out of your life after 8 or 9 p.m., right? Put the screens away.
Easiest, you say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is. All you do is flip the switch. Anyway. All right. Well, are there any other questions? Jim? Okay, yes.
I'd like to offer the Malik's, if they'd like to talk about what happens in the transplant process. I'm approaching 2 years post-transplant, and I'd be happy to help. And I went through a rejection, so I had to switch hospitals. So I've been there, done that, and I will offer my help.
And we've been quarantined since February of 2019 when we made our emergency trip to get a transplant at Houston. And so since that time, we have been pretty much under quarantine.
Marianne,
Oh.
Almost 2 years since February.
unimaginable.
Yeah,
What are you two credit with keeping you afloat? I mean, here you are.
I think it's, for me, it's your state of mind and changing your way of thinking about what you're really thankful for.
you have to become much more thoughtful, much more patient. You have to be able to not react as quickly to things. You kind of have to let the world go by. There's not much way you can take everything personally and survive. That's, I think, the hardest lesson to learn and probably the most needed message that you have.
Yeah.
And for me, it's been a roller coaster ride all the way, but that's what life is all about. And right now, I feel very content and happy in my little cozy downsized home.
Yeah.
Yeah, in spite of everything.
We really have to brag on Jim and Marianne because, Jim, you have to refresh me. Usually if you get a lung transplant, you're in the hospital a long time. I mean, more than a month or so. And Jim, how long? They had you lungs in and you out? How fast was that?
Well, I came out fairly quickly. I was, but I had to go back in twice for drug reactions. And strangely enough, they were affecting my mind. That was the reaction. I ended up with 4 different drugs that I could no longer take. And, but of the first 60 days I passed the transplant, I was in the hospital 40 of those. But the first time was about 17 days, something like that.
Yeah, it was unbelievable. And you looked fantastic. You got out, walked out of the hospital like, oh, well,
Well, the thing that is the most, I credit the most for getting through that so quickly was being in pretty good physical shape. I'm a lifetime runner and walker, and I was in pretty good shape going in. I used to get when I was on the ICU floor in the transplant ward, they would take us out for a walk. And normally there's about 20 people go with you when you go on a walk. And there's several in front of you, several beside you, and then a whole bunch behind you with a wheelchair in case you fall. I mean, they have everything covered. And I used to work my way through the crowd and get to the front of it and just walk them. So that was kind of my mental challenge that kept me going, so that I was controlling, not them. So it was a mind game even then.
fantastic.
Extraordinary, truly. And for the two of you to have found the support in each other and now to be so generative and to pay that forward to the community. Marianne, you mentioned gratitude, which is so key too, right?
I think gratitude is probably the thing that keeps us going the most.
Yeah.
Because you cannot see your family. We haven't seen them for 2 years. I mean, for any major holiday, for 2 years, Thanksgiving and Christmas. But, you just have to realize that, we're just very happy that they are safe and that Jim is alive. Right. And that we can still see them on FaceTime or, run over for a quick, brief visit with my face protector, my face shield, and my mask. And these are the blessings that I have. And I'm very, very grateful for them.
I love that. It's so interesting. If you look at the research on interventions that yield an anti-inflammatory benefit, and there's a benefit to cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, which Jim, you actually sound like an ACT therapist and talking about like like those are not my problems. I'm just going to let those float past. But interestingly, one of the other documented benefits is associated with gratitude. And in the research, they operationalize it because it may not be people's default mental state to feel grateful and instead to feel angry and guilty. And the way that they operationalize gratitude in the research is to give people a writing prompt. And, it could be longhand or on a typewriter. And the prompt is, think of someone that you owe a thank you to, and what would you say to them and why? And it's like an assignment that promotes a mental attitude of gratitude, and it demonstrates a tangible change in the physiology. It has a potent anti-inflammatory benefit.
Mm.
You're probably the healthiest person we know here, Marianne, frankly.
I must say, the road has not been easy for me, and I've had to work very, very hard, harder than you might expect. But it's a constant battle to get where I want to be.
Yeah.
And Jim survived 3 ER visits in the past 2 years, and so it's just been a journey.
Yeah.
But good luck to the Maliks.
Yes, good luck.
I really am pulling for you.
Yes.
We had one more question about melatonin, then Bill Vick wants to say a few things. So the question was, what time should you take the melatonin before bed to make sure you're going to sleep? I guess at a reasonable hour.
An hour.
And I've heard time release melatonin is the most helpful.
I love that suggestion too. Scott, your point is such a good one. And, for jet lag, you use melatonin because it's never clear, right? Like, do I take it at my bedtime or the new bedtime? So you take it at the time you want to fall asleep. So you should embed it into your sleep hygiene routine. Mm-hmm. On the sleep hygiene side, it's a routine. It's the same thing every night. You shut the screens off. It's brushing your teeth, right? To Shelley's point about our gut bacteria. Wash your face or get a drink of water, right? You do the same thing every night at the same time. You take your melatonin tablet, get into bed. Some people will read. It's whatever your bedtime routine is. But our pineal gland produces melatonin in darkness. So your body will naturally turn on melatonin production when you turn the lights out. So you can give that a little bit of a head start by taking that tablet a little bit before bedtime.
Great.
And play with it, right? This is, I think, Marianne's point about how hard you have to work at all of this stuff. You guys are the biohacking experts. Play with it and research it and log it. Treat it just like any other research study, right? Like, okay, here's how I woke up feeling after half a tablet at 9 p.m. And here's, I woke up at 3 a.m. and couldn't go back to sleep when I took, when I bit off just a corner of a tablet at 9 p.m. It's track it over time to find just the right way that it's going to work for you.
Okay, good. What about Bill Vick now? He's been waiting to talk.
And for those of my friends here that know me, you know how difficult it is for me not to talk. It's really, really hard. But I got some new teeth and I lisp a little bit when I talk, but I had to say, Dr. Gorgens, you are a rock star. I mean, this has been such a wonderful, engaging meeting. Just awesome. I can't describe it to you, how I feel watching you, listening to you. I've got 2 pages of notes. It's great, dead-on meeting. And Shelley Mathis, you are a rock star. What a great job you did in running this meeting. It's one of the best. It's one of the best meetings we've had. You've done a super job. And I have to say, comments, excuse me, and we all know this in our hearts. Sometimes we don't say it. Our caregivers are angels. You all are. Marianne, you bring it to a head. And without a question, as I look around here, Alice, I look at so many, our caregivers are our strength and truly our angels in disguise. And I don't think any of us would be doing nearly as well as we do without them. And I have to say, we owe them a great debt and of gratitude for what they do. And I want to say thank you. And including my supporter, Patty refuses the word caregiver supporter. And next time we have a meeting, which will probably be Shelley, in January, but
Yes,
I'll be walking and talking and chewing gum and doing all the important things in life. So I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. Great job, Shelley. Dr. Gorgens, you are phenomenal. Just love
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. If I can be helpful, Shelley has my contact information, standing offer. Thank you for hanging in for the entirety of your Saturday morning. And if anything pings on your radar is like completely absurd, get in touch with that later. And if you want to trade nerdy science articles anytime, my door is always open for that too. I love it. And sending good luck to the Malik. So
Yes.
mhm.
Thank you all for joining us. Have a safe and happy holiday season, and we'll see you back in January. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Shelley. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Dr. Gorgon.